Okay, so we are going to pick up first with our prologue. And of course, in the kind of first 30 lines or so of the poem, we are introduced to the course. And I guess um, before we're really introduced to the course, your book provides us with a list of characters that is not provided, ironically enough, in the A text, but it is there because it makes it easier. Anyways, we are introduced to the major characters, including Faustus, this German professor at Wittenberg who has turned into a magician, his servant. Wagner, Mephistopheles, the tempting demon, and Lucifer, his lord, and a host of minor characters that include three scholars who hope to learn from Faustus, a troupe of clowns or country bumpkins whose quest for silly powers parody Faustus's own desires, like Rafe and Robin, a set of high status characters, including the Pope, the Emperor, and a Duchess, and a set of allegorical characters, including Faustus's good and bad angels, the seven deadly sins, which are a stock favorite of medieval moralities, and also Helen of Troy and the old man. So we will talk about all of them in some form or capacity, but essentially this play, in brief, is about this scholar who seeks the ultimate wisdom, and with it, the ultimate power, but becomes obsessed with power to neglect his spiritual side. He has this demon that he summons and tempts him to surrender his soul for a brief period of time and for a brief period of exotic earthly powers. His servant and a gang of comic characters and a subplot mirror Faustus' search for earthly power, but with markedly less success. Faustus trades his spirit for illusions like his vision of Helen, and he remains confident in his own damnation until the end. And we'll talk about how he kind of is confident in his own damnation, but also kind of denies this existence of hell at the same time. So, anyways, in our introduction of Faustus, in the prologue, we have our course. And our course is going to act throughout the play as an intermediary between the audience and the performance. And the course really kind of begins by announcing topics that the play won't cover. And then we are introduced to Faustus. We find out that he is born of his parents are of base stock, which shows that this is a story of an ordinary man aligning the audience with him. We are on the same level, which is markedly different than the typical tragic hero of the Greek tragedies and even Shakespeare's tragedies. So we find out that he is German. He comes from Wittenberg, and this people is the home of Martin Luther. Germany is the home of the printing press. It's no coincidence that Faustus comes from the place that is instrumental in the dissemination of knowledge and instrumental in the wave of the Protestant reform. And we also find out that despite his humble origins, he is honored with a doctorate degree in which he excels. And that goes back to that emphasis on the Renaissance idea of human achievement. There is room for somebody who improves themselves through knowledge. And Faustus really represents that kind of Renaissance man. But then of course we have this allusion to Icarus. He is so swollen with self-conceit he flies too close to the sun. He is glutted more with golden gifts and turns to necromancy. And there's a couple things worth noting here. Faustus is full of pride. That is his fatal flaw. And that is not unlike, if you think of his desire is for power and for knowledge. And that is not unlike man, as in, human beings. Man in the Garden of Eden, what is their sin? Their ultimate sin is learning, is the eating from the tree of knowledge. And so uh, there's also in our prologue this mention of sin and black magic or necromancy, which of course in the Renaissance period would have been considered kind of these magic arts, the conjuring of spirits, alchemy, anything that was kind of unorthodox and uh, atheist, for lack of a better word. So it also shows that he is hungry for power. I already said that it is the parallel to the fall of man and forbidden fruit, but his ambition is excessive. He is an overreacher, and this is something that's incredibly important to note about Faustus. And Faustus, in some ways, like I was saying, he is the typical man of the Renaissance, the typical person of the Renaissance. He represents kind of that spirit of the age when we are these overreaching people who want to discover more, who want more power. Think about the expansion of the British Empire from to the colonies in the Americas to defeating like these world superpowers like Spain. It is that, it is the spirit of the age, and Faustus really very much embodies that spirit. And it also emphasizes that, or reflects that commitment to Renaissance values of classical learning, to the turn of study of mankind. Faustus, like I said, he is this real Renaissance man, and unlike medieval tales of someone great and famous, we are introduced to someone who is ordinary, and that's kind of the point. So anyways, scene one, we are told that Faustus is alone in his study, and he says, "Settle thy studies, Faustus." He shows that he is no longer interested in the things that he already knows. There is no real challenge. There's no real sufficient challenge for him, and he goes through these dictates of medieval scholarship that were based on authority instead of being wise. And note that Faustus is interested. He wants to give up things that he knows, but he's not interested in what he has to learn. If that makes sense. There is this rejection of the medieval way of thinking, where he decides to strike out on his own to a greater subject fitteth for Faustus's wit, which is, of course, necromancy. And I think that it's important to note here his use of the third person. He refers to himself as Faustus, not I, not me, as this kind of I, it's like me if I all of a sudden started calling myself, well, Miss Swan thinks this, Miss Swan thinks that. Like this use of the third person is a sign of his own self-importance, his own narcissism, his own assertion of his, like, this deluded sense of control that he has over what he's doing. And I guess also in some ways, like, it could be seen as this kind of disconnect from the things that he's doing. Like, he's kind of disassociating himself with himself. I don't know. Anyways, but I think it's more like this kind of sign of his own self-importance, this reference to himself in the third person. So he rejects philosophy. and logic, because there's nothing logical about what he ends up doing, right? Medicine, the law. He says that he'd only be a doctor if he could be the same as Jesus and raise men from the dead or live eternally. He rejects the law, and ultimately he rejects religion. And he explicitly tells us that he decides to devote his life to magic, and says, a sound magician is a mighty god. He essentially wants to displace God and have dominion over humanity and everything on earth. He calls for Wagner, his servant, to send for his friends, and then we meet the good angel and the evil angel. And this juxtaposition of the two angels remind us as an audience of the difference between good and bad actions. And one view of, or one interpretation of how to view the good and bad angels is it allows us to keep our moral perspective clear, because clearly Faustus's is clouded and mismatched. He has the choice of who to listen to, and essentially it shows that he knows that there are two paths. He has free will, but he chooses to follow the evil one. He is a conscious sinner. The good angel tries to warn Faustus that magic will anger God, but the evil angel tempts him, and he says that magic will give him power as Lord and commander of all. And so at this point, based on his monologue, Faustus is not yet I mean, clearly he's not a saint, but he is not yet this kind of unredeemable sinner. But his ambition puts him at risk. But we also see that his desire, and he is always going to be tempted by that sense of power and control. So Cornelius and Valdez enter, and these are characters who will aid in his fall. They tempt Faustus with dark magic. He needs their help. And books. One of them says, "Books, Faustus's wit and our experience shall make all nations canonize us." And then of course at the end of scene one we have this vow to conjure the devil, and this already preconceived idea that therefore with this conjuring therefore he will die. Okay, so scene one ends with this really kind of ominous feel, and we move into scene two. And I'm not going to talk too much about the comedy scenes in much of an aspect, because while they're important, I want to save a little bit of time and end up talking about the more meat and potatoes of this play. But I do want to mention scene two in a sense, because it is the first of our comic scenes. It acts as a break from the intensity of scene one, and the purpose is for entertainment or for laughter. And it uses Wagner to poke fun at the previous scholarly discourse with Faustus and his friends, with this parody of a scholarly argument, which ultimately reinforces these tragic elements. And while this is a comic interlude, it is also a comment on Faustus's actions. Faustus's choices affect more than just him, specifically Wagner, who tries to imitate his master. And people are concerned over Faustus's choice. The two scholars in the scene want to kind of reclaim him, but ultimately they represent his old way of life. And by turning to necromancy, he's abandoning that old way, but he is also abandoning them too. He's essentially going to live this horrible life of isolation and alienation, and not really and I guess that kind of goes to one of our themes, kind of that meaning of life. What's important? Is it time wasted? But I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up with a bunch of the other scenes, and stay tuned.